Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host,
Christopher Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content, and before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes, so we are now going through our long-awaited off-season reviews where we're going through each and every NBA team. We'll see how the format goes, see if maybe we make some adjustments to it, right? Just because, maybe you want to hear your team talked about earlier as opposed to going 2 months later without hearing your team. So we'll see how that goes. We'll probably rope some discussions in there, but we'll start like we usually do, like we've done each year with the NBA champions. And so this time the Oklahoma City Thunder, right, who defeated the Indiana Pacers in 7 games and, kind of went into the season as, even though, there were a lot of skeptics, right? They were one of the Vegas favorites. They weren't the favorite. I believe it was Boston, if I'm not mistaken, going back and looking. But a lot of people did believe that this team, worst case scenario, was going to be better than last year and was going to be probably the one seed by far. And they were, right? They ended up winning 68 games. They were the number 1 defense by a wide margin, right? The best net rating, if I'm not mistaken, in NBA history, pretty much, right? And all led by SGA, right? The MVP, got the triple crown, regular season MVP, championship, and finals MVP, right? All at, a pretty young age, right? What is he right now? He's 27 years old, so pretty much kind of at that point where he's getting ready to enter his prime, right? So now he's established himself as one of the best players. Some people may make the case the best player, right? But at worst, right, top 2-3 player in the league. So now the other key that we were waiting for going into last season was, all right, what do the rest of the guys look like? Because they didn't look as good a year ago, right, against the Dallas Mavericks, right? Jalen Williams struggled, Chet Holmgren struggled. We know that. And then going into this postseason, that was the same question. Could Jalen Williams be a number 2 guy? And he showed he could be. Now, he had some ugly stretches, right? Maybe some of that's explained by it seemed like he had surgery to repair his wrist. I think he had a sprained, fractured wrist or hand or whatever. So he's going to be out for a little bit of time. But he showcased that at his best, he could be a really good number 2 option, right? He had 40 points in an NBA Finals game to help the Thunder go up 3-2, right? And despite the fact that they had a dominant regular season, they did have a lot of big wins at home in Oklahoma City. But it wasn't the easiest path in the world because they did have to go through 2 teams in a Game 7. They were at home, but they did have to win 2 Game 7s, right? In order, one to advance to the conference finals and the other to win the title, right? Now, obviously, the Pacers, Haliburton got hurt, but Oklahoma City saved themselves, right, by winning that huge Game 4, right, where they were down in the 4th quarter, looked like they were going to go down 3-1, clinch the win, and then they were able to basically, in my opinion, kind of put a stamp on the series, even though, again, maybe Haliburton doesn't get hurt, who knows, but that doesn't really matter. They're the NBA champions, but if you look at their offseason, they didn't really have to do a ton, right? Most of what they did was re-signing and bringing back a lot of their key guys. They re-signed Chet Holmgren to a big max extension, right? Over $40 million a year. And then also Jalen Williams, right? Over $40 million a year max extension. That's kind of the key signings there. They also extended SGA, right? He has basically the largest contract at this point pretty much in NBA history, where by the end of it, he's going to be making over $70 million a season, right? Which, is ginormous, but he's worth every penny because he's the best player on the team. He's their franchise, their everything, and he led them to a title. So more than worth it for that Supermax extension. And then after that, they extended a couple of their other role players. They extended Jalen Williams, the big man, right? They gave him a 4-year deal. Then they also gave, if I'm not mistaken, AJ Mitchell, right? An extra couple years on his deal as well. And then in the draft, right, they took Thomas Sorber, right? They took the big man out of Georgetown. And we'll see how much playing time he gets because, the roster's deep, but there's already guys that kind of seemingly have a set role in the rotation. So worst case scenario, maybe he's a guy where somebody's out, he just steps in and comes in and plays like a relatively basic big man role, right? Like running the floor, maybe blocking shots, catching lobs, right? An element of that, they have some bigs that can do certain things, like say like a Chet Holmgren can catch lobs. I guess Hartenstein can catch lobs. They're not quite as bouncy, I don't think, as Sorber. He's a little bit undersized compared to those guys, but he's very strong and he's a good athlete. And I think it's a good pick, and I think he'll fit in fine, right? Because like it doesn't hurt to have another big on the roster, especially when you kind of look at some of the teams that they played against. There were times where the double big lineup wasn't quite as impactful, and then sometimes if it was one big and it was Chet, maybe he got a little bit bodied by some of the more physical guys out there. So no issues with that pick, right? Then the other key guy is your guy, Nikola Topic, who was drafted
Not
last
my guy.
year. Yeah,
It's
who was
not my
drafted,
guy.
who was drafted last year and did not play at all last year because of the torn ACL that he had playing overseas. And he's what? The only guy that won a championship without playing like a single game or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
So he's got that distinction. He's still only 19 years old. So he's very young. He just recently turned 19, if I'm not, or he's going to turn 20, I think, in August.
Yeah.
So he's still pretty young, despite, not really having played a whole lot. If anything, he hasn't played in the NBA at all. But, one of the strengths that people kind of talked about is he's kind of a big, tall point guard type guy, right? Where he can handle the ball, he can pass, he can play make, right? We'll see what he can do at the NBA level. He played in the summer league, right? And we did see him a couple of times. Looked okay in some spots. Basically, the areas that you knew he was good at, he looks good at. Like, he looks good at passing. He looks fine, bringing the ball up the floor and running your offense. But the areas that we kind of thought, this might be a little bit of a struggle, looked like a kind of a struggle for him, right? Where he's not crazy great at finishing, right? You can kind of see that there's a little bit of hesitation when it comes to finishing around the basket. Then the jump shooting, not necessarily there either. It's summer league, so take it with a grain of salt. We'll see what it looks like when he actually plays with the actual team. How many minutes will he play? The nice thing for Oklahoma City is we already know that this team was good enough to win the title because they just did it. They're basically running it back, but they will get a couple of young reinforcements who didn't play at all last year to, make the roster even deeper, right? So I don't really see any real reason why there should be a drop off. Of course, you're going to have the issue of, all right, well, these guys already won the title, and how much hunger is there to win the next one after you've already put in all the work to win the first one? So it wouldn't surprise me maybe if, like record wise, maybe net ratings wise, maybe they're a little bit worse, but they're still going to be the best team in the league, I think, and they're going to be the favorites going into next season. It's just a matter of whether or not they're going to be prohibitive favorites or are they just the favorites just by being the best team. And that's where I'm curious to see. But I think they can be even better next year because then you look at even their young stars, J-Dub and Chet Holmgren, right? Those guys, if they get better and continue to improve mostly on the offensive end, right? If J-Dub can continue to make strides, creating and, everything that we kind of saw a little bit of a struggle with sometimes in the postseason, right? Where it's like, sometimes he's given the ball tasked with being the secondary guy. And there were times where he couldn't quite get it done, but then there were times where he did. So he has it in him. He just has to continue to get more reps and get better at it. And then with Chet, continue to add more strength and physicality onto his frame. And then I guess offensively, maybe expand a little bit even more. What else can he really do, right? We saw at least in the regular season and sometimes in the postseason, he flashed the ability to put the ball on the floor as a big, make the extra pass, make the extra read. So we know that he's got some other skills other than just your typical rim running big man or stretch five big man. So we know he's got that. Just continue to improve on those type of skills, and I think they'll be perfectly fine. And I think they'll be in a great spot to go back to the finals, worst case scenario next year. Now, of course, history is not on their side. The last 7, 8 champions or whatever, none of them went back to back. None of them got to the finals. None of them even got to the conference finals. Not even, not even to the conference finals. So history doesn't suggest that they're going to get back there. But the question is, could they be the team best equipped of all the recent champions to actually do it and go back to back? Probably, yeah, I would say so. Just because even if they didn't really add any significant players, you just expect a lot of these other guys to get better. But in fairness, right, we did see some teams in the Western Conference improve, including a couple teams like, say, Denver, right, who pushed Oklahoma City to the limit. So could they do it again and maybe potentially overtake Oklahoma City this year, especially maybe if some things don't break their way, maybe there's injuries, maybe there's, weird matchups or weird situations, whatever, maybe. But I think Oklahoma City is still poised, to be the best team in the league, best team in the Western Conference. And I think I would need to see another team prove it before I'm just automatically, going to make the case that there's no way they get out of the West again. Because, I mean, they should. But, of course, like I said, history is not necessarily on their side.
For sure. I agree with that. And I think this is a good conversation to have, because I think in our time doing this podcast, we haven't really covered a team like Oklahoma City winning a championship like this, right? They're so young, right? Like, think about the champions that we have covered, right? We've covered the Boston Celtics, we've covered the Denver Nuggets, right? Those are teams where those cores were long in establishment way before, we even thought of doing a podcast, right? So that's the beauty of the Thunder, right? They're so young. Obviously, the rookie extensions will kick in soon, but that's the cool part. They have so much financial flexibility at this point where you can't give them anything but an A+ for their offseason, because they didn't lose anybody, right? Like, the thing with Denver was, I think you and I were very concerned when, they lost guys like, KCP. You lost guys like Bruce Brown as well, right? And those were guys that were very pivotal to your core winning that championship. So in this case, you don't have any departures. You really only have additions. That, I think, could be a double-edged sword potentially, because then, the minutes get crowded. Not everybody's going to be able to play, especially come postseason. So what does that look like? I'm sure, they'll find lineups that work and don't work, obviously. But yeah, you have to hand it to them. They handled this offseason, kind of normally, I think, how a normal team would. But like I said, they didn't really have any departures. I think down the line is where things might get murky and a little bit funky for them, because they're going to have to make some big time decisions. You can't keep everybody for, an extended period of time. But for the here and now, you can't give them anything but an A+, I feel like, because you extended your superstar. You extended, your second and third option, who, were playing on a rookie contract. So to win a title on rookie contracts is crazy, by the way, especially if you're the second and third option. So, I think the youth of this team is what makes, their offseason so great, because you didn't lose anybody.
Right. Because, and that's kind of a good point where you mentioned, for the here and now, they're perfectly fine, right? And, again, they could also easily be set up for the future as well. Like you said, once you get down the line with the aprons, things could get messy. But say, with Boston, right, we knew going into this past season, right, that there may be a chance that they were going to have to break it up, because everybody was saying the second apron's coming in, right? There's new ownership, so they're not necessarily going to be able to keep that core together. Plus, like you said, the age factor where, yeah, Tatum and Brown are still relatively young guys, but both of those guys are still in their late 20s. Whereas with Oklahoma City, SGA is 27. And then I guess, say a Caruso is 30 or whatever, or over 30, but everyone else is mostly in their early mid-20s or whatever, right? Everybody's pretty young on that roster. So, and also, like you said, you have the added factor of Oklahoma City doesn't even have to worry about the apron issues for at least another season, right? Because they're under the tax this year. Then, say next year, once those big contracts kick in, well, that's just the first year, right? It's not really as much of an issue until you get to the second year where you're in the second apron, and then all the repeater taxes, and then everything else comes in, and then you're basically and then you're basically cooked.
Yeah.
Right. But again, that's a few seasons from now. We're quite a ways away from that, and who knows what the league will look like, right?
Yeah.
There may be some other cores or teams that we're not even thinking of right now that may be, kind of in that spot. But and even some of the players that I didn't even mention, say a Cason Wallace, that's another young guy where, hey, he started for them in the finals, didn't do a whole lot, but maybe he gets better and expands his offensive game. And like you said, you feel like you're going to get to a point where, well, all these guys aren't necessarily going to be able to just play, because even in the playoffs, right, they're kind of got to be a stretch where Isaiah Joe, you're not going to get as many minutes, right? Or, even Jay Will, there are series where you're not even going to play at all, right? Or, even in the case of an Aaron Wiggins, some games you'll play, some games you won't. So it just kind of, is back and forth. So that's nice to have the depth right now. But again, like I said, worst case scenario, like they're still going to be probably somewhere around a 60-win team or better and should still have, a really high percentage chance of getting back to the finals. Now, again, we'll see if they go back to back, and we don't have to do our preseason picks yet. I guess, do you feel like that they're a prohibitive favorite, or do you think that they're just the favorite?
I think they're the favorite. It's tough because the league that we're covering now has so much parity, right? It seems like the dynasty era is over, and we have a very bad habit of, declaring the the current champion as the next dynasty, and not just us. That a lot of podcasts, a lot of NBA media do that, right? And I think it's just because in the era that we watched and grew up with, there were several dynasties, right, that were very successful. So, my instinct tells me that this team will most likely win back to back, because I think one thing that they're underrated in is health, for sure, right? Like, a lot of these guys don't really miss a ton of time. The only one who did significantly last year was, I believe, Chet and Hartenstein too, but Chet was the main one who was out, and a lot of their damage was done without Chet, which is freaking scary. So the development of all their young guys, I think they're going to take another step forward, and that's the part that scares me about the team. And I don't know if anybody can really compete with that, because you already have, like you said, a top 3, top 1 player, in my opinion, in Shea at the helm. If J-Dub and Chet can continue to ascend, which I think they will, that's perfect. And then you have young complementary pieces. I think the writing is on the wall with this one. I think they go back to back.
Yeah, and that's kind of the case is that, hey, like last year, J-Dub was an all-star, and I guess he was named, like to All-NBA, but part of that was some guys were hurt, and there were a 68-win team, so it'd feel kind of weird to only have one NBA guy on there. But let's say he takes the real leap, and it's like, okay, no, he actually is basically going to be like a top 15-ish player, right? That's usually like kind of the pathway to All-NBA, somewhere in that realm.
Mm-hmm.
Like if he gets there, right? And let's say Chet Holmgren, maybe not All-NBA, but maybe borderline All-Star, right? Maybe all defense because he wasn't on there because he missed too many games.
Mm-hmm.
Then that's where, like you said, that's where you have basically potentially a real big 3 with some depth, right? Which would be the scariest type of team composition to have, but also very difficult to pull off because of, you got to either draft, you got to get lucky, maybe you sign a free agent, but most of their success has come through outside of SGA, right? Like the draft, right? Because like they drafted Chet, they drafted J-Dub, they did trade for SGA, they didn't draft him, right? But they have developed him, and then some of the other guys like Case and Wallace, that's a draft pick, right? So, a lot of that is a little bit different. So, right now, I think that they should be the favorites to go back to back, right? And that's not like a surprise. It's not like a hot take or anything. I think, I think they probably have the best chance of winning the title just because, like you said, of course, injuries can always happen, but say like SGA doesn't really miss a whole lot of time, right? And that's important. Now, Tatum didn't really miss a lot of time, and then he tore his Achilles, right? But maybe you make the case, well, he went on so many deep playoff runs, he's got more wear and tear than a guy like SGA, right? So maybe you make that case. I don't know how much that really holds up, but I think that's a good point to make, where it's like this probably should be the one that we feel the most confident about, because like say with Denver, they made no real moves after winning the title, right? Like you said, they only really lost guy. I mean, what did they lose? Bruce Brown, and then I think Jeff Green.
Right? KCP, right?
KCP, I think, was the year later. I think
really?
He was. Yeah, he was on the team.
You're right. Yeah. You're right.
Yeah, but they did lose Bruce Brown and Jeff Green, right?
Yeah.
And then Boston ran it back, but you didn't really look at anybody on the roster and automatically be like, they're going to be better. Now, we did say Tatum could be better, right? And he was better during the regular season.
Massively.
Like, he actually was, which is the crazy part. Yeah. But you had down years from a number of other guys, and you probably needed them to at least kind of stay close. Like Porzingis, once they got to the playoffs, he was bad, right? In the regular season, when he played, he was fine.
Yeah.
But he barely played. And then he had the worst illness you'll ever see in terms
For
of
real.
sports. For
Yeah.
whatever reason, I'm still not really sure what happened there. But
Yeah.
also, Jaylen Brown had a down year, so there was that too.
Hmm.
So there wasn't really a strong case there. And then for Denver, like they looked good in the regular season. They had the one bad loss to Devontae Graham right in the regular season, and
Yeah.
then they looked good against the Wolves, and then blew a 20-point lead in the second half, which is still kind of crazy. But something stupid could easily happen. But on paper, they're well equipped, more than well equipped to go back to back. And as of right now, I think it's hard pressed to find, another team where you can feel confident that they're going to win more than Oklahoma City.
Yeah.
I think
For
that's a
sure.
really hard one to sell.
Yeah, bro.
Now,
It's crazy.
yeah, now I guess looking at SGA,
Yeah.
is there a case for him to be even better?
That's crazy. I mean, right? You got to highlight the positives with the guy, right? Scoring through the roof, right? Guaranteed 30 a night, 30 plus. Gets to his spot, and that's the hardest part of basketball, right? Like, is getting to your spot comfortably, and then obviously making the shot. So he's got all that. I think the 3-point percentage could be better, but I'm not going to knock him for it because it's his game. It works, right? But the aspect that I want to see him get better in, and I know he can get better in because we saw flashes of it, is the playmaking, right?
Right.
It's similar to Anthony Edwards, right? But the cool part about Shea is he has the face-up game, right? He's already got the fadeaway mastered. The mid-range is his. But I think his ability to play make out of those, tough situations is something to watch, because I think if he can continue to do that, then that's going to be a key, aspect as to why, Chet and J-Dub, can ascend as well. So I think if he can find a way to shoulder the load, but also make his guys better around him, in terms of on the court, like off the court, we already know he's the bona fide leader. He's the alpha, but on the court in terms of ball, I want to see him get better at playmaking, and I think he can do that.
Yeah, and like you said, there were flashes where in the finals, right, he had a couple of bad playmaking games, right, and it really showcased itself. And then we saw a couple of great ones, right, where he had double-digit assists, and he was able to kind of use his ability to score to set up everybody else and get easy shots, right? Even against Denver, right, there was a couple of games where he kind of, in my opinion, shot themselves out of the game,
I agree.
shot them out of the game, where I just thought he kind of settled for shots you don't like. And the funny thing is, in the regular season, he actually shot very well from three. We're like basically, a career high, both in terms of attempts and percentage.
Yes.
But then in the playoffs, it dipped, which happens to most guys. But like you said, it didn't matter because he's so good at other areas of the floor and can still get to his spots pretty much whenever he wants. So we covered most of that. So now I guess then the question is, let's say Oklahoma City doesn't get out of the Western Conference. Which team do you feel like as of right now has the best chance to pull off the upset?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, after that, it's kind of wide open. I mean, like, I'm not okay. Maybe not wide open. Wide open's not the right term, but there's a couple of people waiting in line for sure. I would say my personal would be Houston. I know we have no idea what that team is going to look like, but on paper, I love the addition of Katie. They got their go-to guy, and that's what they were missing. I think the youth and inexperience might be a potential hindrance to them getting out of the West if Oklahoma City doesn't. But at the end of the day, I think I have confidence in that team, what they've built over there. Ime Udoka, the culture, everything seems to be very fitting. So it wouldn't surprise me if Oklahoma City gets bounced. All right, then Houston is next up. Like that's kind of the way that I'm looking at it. But I think Denver is low key sneaky elite. I like their offseason. I know we'll get to them at some point during the summer, but I think their offseason has been pretty phenomenal. So I like the improvements that they have. And obviously, if you have Jokic, I think, there's a pathway for them to get, to the Western Conference Finals for sure. Depending on how much internal development goes on with this team, I would say Minnesota as well.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair assessment. It's more so, I think, like the main thing is kind of, what do you feel between Denver and Houston? It feels like Minnesota did not match up well against Oklahoma City, and unless they can figure out, like you said, the internal development, the playmaking, which, like I said, we'll get to them little bit later.
Mhm.
But if they can't figure that out, then it's going to be tough for them to beat Oklahoma City,
I
right?
agree.
Because they haven't really made a ton of moves either. So,
Yeah.
but they were in a different spot than Oklahoma City. Denver and Houston are the two to look out for. For Houston, it's leap from Amen Thompson, can especially as a creator, and everything else. And
Mhm.
then for Denver, it's more so. Well, they took Oklahoma City to 7 last year. Now they've added more depth. They swapped out MPJ with Cam Johnson, who should be pretty similar, right? Maybe in some cases better, maybe in some cases worse. But overall, with all the other additions, it's a bonus, right? It's an improvement
Yes.
from what it was. Valanciunas seems like they figured that out. So they have a real chance too, right? And they also have Jokic, right, who again, even though he's not 27, he's still in his prime and can pretty much match up against just about anybody. Even though Oklahoma City had a couple of games where they did a really good job in guarding him, about as well as anybody has. So, but I'd still say Oklahoma City would be, I'd say a strong favorite against the rest of the field. Of course, you always have injuries, and that's kind of the tough part to bank on. But they're over under 62.5. So, what do we feel about that one? Do we feel like this is an over or an under? Again, we don't offer betting
Yeah.
advice and all
Yeah.
that, but we use this to kind of gauge,
Mm.
how we feel about where they're ranked,
I'm gonna
where
have
they're
to.
rated.
I'm gonna have to go over respectfully.
Okay.
Um,
Mhm.
I know they won what 68 last
68.
year. I mean, I would probably say ballpark 65. I don't see them taking a step back where they're under 62. That would be disappointing in my opinion.
Yeah, I would go over as well. I guess the case that somebody may make for them going under, the only case that somebody might make might just be, hey, the Western Conference got better, so there's not as many teams to just beat up on. But I guess you could also make the case the Eastern Conference got worse, and even though you only play those teams twice, there's maybe a couple more teams that you might be able to steal some wins
Mm-hmm.
from. But I mean, they beat almost everybody in the regular season last year. I mean, they only lost 14 times,
Mm-hmm.
so they didn't really, so they didn't really lose to a ton of teams in the regular season. But that might be the case. But like you said, for it to be under, you're talking about close to a 10-game difference between this season and last season, and I just don't feel like you're
Mm-mm.
gonna have that much of a drop off unless you have a bunch of injuries, right? That to me is probably like the only real case, which could happen. It can happen to any team, but if they're relatively healthy, right, given what we've seen from them, yeah, I would say that one's an over.
Yeah, I agree.
Now, just for giggles, just so
What's
that
up?
that way we don't really have to spend a ton of time, we might as well
Yeah.
also mention different conference, but we might as well mention the runner-up from from the NBA Finals,
Oh yeah,
Pacers.
yeah, yeah. We can talk about them. You want to group
Yeah,
them
just
into this?
yeah, we'll group them into
Okay.
it because I'm not really banking on them really doing a whole lot of stuff from here on
Sure.
out. But for the Indiana Pacers again, the runner-up, we know what happened. Great season last year. Went to a Game 7 in the NBA Finals. Cut short with the Haliburton injury. Pretty awful.
Yeah.
And since then, they lost Myles Turner. He walked and went to Milwaukee. And then after that, other than that, it's mainly just been re-signing a couple guys and bringing a couple guys in through trade. They traded for Jay Huff. They re-signed Tony Bradley. They also brought back James Wiseman. And that's pretty much it. Isaiah Jackson, they also re-signed as well. So they really haven't done a lot. I guess if you look at their draft, they gave a couple of two-way contracts out, right? They took Cam Jones and they took Talon Peter, right? But they're two-way guys. So how much are they really going to be playing over the course of the season? Maybe they do, because they'll try to use their depth because they got a decent amount. But in terms of their offseason, what do we think?
Um, Probably go with a C, right? Because losing Myles Turner hurts a lot. However, the only saving grace is the Eastern Conference isn't that good. So I think realistically, right, they could still be in the same spot as they were last year. But Halliburton's hurt, so you're going to have a whole year pretty much without him. You don't have Turner. So, and you didn't really do a whole lot in terms of bringing guys in. Like you said, I mean, hey, at least
They brought in a bunch of centers, I
yeah,
guess.
you brought in a bunch of centers to fill the void of Myles Turner. But I don't know, man. It's rough because it's hard to kind of gauge it because their whole season is always going to be contingent on, Haliburton, and since he's not playing, I don't know. It's going to be a lot of Pascal Siakam, a lot of Nemhard. So maybe they, try and figure some stuff out this season, and then next season, the following one, they'll be able to, maybe get back into shape. But I don't know. There's not a whole lot of positives here, right? So it kind of middles out because I don't want to give them an F. I think a C is okay because, they brought in 4 big men, which is fine. But yeah, losing Turner, I think, definitely stings.
Yeah, it's tough because, some people have made the case that, well, his defense isn't what it used to be. Do you really want to pay him like $30 million a year? And then I guess once you're in that second apron or whatever, they're gonna get into once they have to pay more, especially you're gonna have a gap year, then it's gonna be more punitive. Then you may be forced to make more moves anyways. It just sucks to lose him because he's still a good player, and you lost a good player and didn't really pick up anybody close to the level of talent in return, right? But like you said, the saving grace is that you did pick up, a handful of bigs to, like you said, fill the void, at least temporarily, right? They're not going to probably be what Myles Turner is, but maybe collectively, you might be okay in that area. But because you don't have Haliburton, that's the part that's kind of just the worst aspect because everybody's going to look so different because everybody plays off of all the great things that he does. And now, you're going to have to see a lot of these guys where you're not going to have Haliburton to kind of be able to be your engine. Like you said, it's going to be a lot more of all these other guys. Now, for some of these guys, right, maybe the increased opportunities may be good for them, once Haliburton comes back, right? Like, say, like Mathurin, Nemhard, maybe Joris Walker, whomever, right? That might be good for a lot of these guys. But, without their main guy, I think it's going to be very difficult for them to really be able to, they're not going to be able to replicate last year, but it's just the question is, how good of a regular season team are they even going to be, when you're having to go 82 games without Haliburton? And I think that's the tough part where, like you said, the East is bad. So maybe they're not a bottom 5 team in the Eastern Conference, but, I struggle to see them being able to get a top 6 seed. I think they're probably going to fall, at best 6, but probably more than likely somewhere in the play-in. But I guess the question is, who do you think the starting center should be? Because in considering all the bigs that they picked up, which guy do you actually want to see starting at the 5? Because, there's a case to be made for all these guys. Jackson, the issue with him is the torn Achilles, so when can he come back? He probably has to be eased into the rotation, so he probably won't start. And then I think Wiseman, he tore his Achilles too. So, going into the season, I mean, your only real healthy centers are Jay Huff and Tony Bradley. So it's probably going to have to be Jay Huff that slides into that starting center spot, if I had to guess, unless they go small.
Yeah, give me Huff. I mean, no, I'm serious. Like, I think he's going to be able to, not necessarily, ball out, but maybe replicate a little bit of what, Myles Turner is able to, right? Like, if you look at Huff and his minutes, and I experienced Huff, and you did as well, right? Like, he was a Laker, he was a Wizard at one point. So I think
we're in the summer league.
Yeah, but we're the best 2 guys to talk about Jay Huff in this situation, right? Also Memphis fans as well, because Memphis last year, he was actually pretty good for them, right? 50 from the field, 40 from the 3. So, he has the ability to stretch the floor and also be efficient in the paint as well. He's got a bag somewhat, right, for a bench big, right? So I think it'll be serviceable for a little bit of time, but eventually it will wear off, and yeah, you're going to see the negatives of having a Jay Huff as your starting center. But I think he can replicate things that Myles Turner did for them. So at the very least, that's the positive from it.
Yeah, and just under 12 minutes a game, 7 points, 2 rebounds, just under a block, 40% from 3 on 3 attempts a game, again in 11, 12 minutes. So so offensively, I think he can probably give you some of what Myles Turner can do.
Yeah.
Like he'll be willing to take and make threes at a pretty good clip. He's an okay athlete. In the G League, I think his athleticism stands out a little bit more than at the NBA level. But, he's a guy that could, worst case scenario, run the floor, play hard, get some putbacks, and then even blocking shots, right? Just the rebounding is a little bit different. But again, because he's taken so many threes, right, there's an element of rebounding that you're not going to see as much anyways. If you're taking out that many threes from out there, not going to get probably quite as many offensive boards. So, that kind of limits the rebounding potential, but they have other guys for that. So I think he slides into the starting center spot, and he'll be, like you said, a okay stopgap, at least for a while. Just, let's say you go into next season and Haliburton's back. Is he going to continue to be the starting center? That's the part that I don't know. I'm not sure what they do there, but they've at least bought themselves some time. And I guess worst case scenario, they traded back for their pick during the finals. So they're not in a scenario where they're going to suck and they're not even going to have their pick. So there is a potential, like it's okay to hit the eject button because they're going to have their pick. So even if they're bad, right, they could potentially come out of it with the lottery pick. Who knows what they're going to do? I don't know what their goals are for next season, but they're definitely not going to be as anywhere near as good as they were last year. That's obvious, right? Because that just doesn't happen when you lose your best player to an injury like that. Because you can't replace him with anybody. It's not like free agency signing where maybe somebody walks and you replace him. He's hurt. He's out. They do have other guards, right, that can do some things, right, from a playmaking and scoring standpoint, but not to the degree that he can. And that's just, you're going to see how valuable he is this year. When he doesn't play, right? Because there were a lot of people who kind of questioned, well, how good is he really? I think you'll see, that they're going to really struggle, I think, without him.
For sure.
Their over-under is 38.5.
Oh, wow, that's rough. I'll have to go under. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I mean,
I now that I'm thinking about it, I do want to backtrack. They're not going to be in the same spot as they were last year. They're going to be worse for sure. But yeah, I think I have to go under on this one.
Yeah, last season they finished 50-32. I feel like it would not be surprising at all if they did worse than that. Because again, they have the excuse of they have their own first. So it would be so if they're going to be bad, it'd be better if they're worse than bad, right? Than to kind of just be in that weird playing mix. But then the thing is, that bottom of the East, you're not going to be worse than those teams, right? You're not going to be worse than Washington or Brooklyn or probably Charlotte either, I don't think, right? So that's the part where it might be tough, but I think I might go under with this one. Again, they do have a lot of other talented players, but I could see a scenario where, like, it's not working, some guys get shut down, right? And then they just kind of are okay with going into the lottery and then doing whatever they're going to do out of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's tough, right? A tale of two different off seasons from two teams that were in the NBA Finals. But that's the thing about injuries. They really stink. And I'm curious to see where Indiana goes from here because, going into prior to that injury, right, you kind of looked at them as one of the bright teams of the Eastern Conference, where like you kind of were like, all right, they've proven that they're going to be a fixture in the Eastern Conference for quite some time, but now there's at least 1 year where it's going to be a gap year. So, that's where I'm kind of wondering, like, what is the future for this team? I guess we have to wait and see when Haliburton comes back 2 seasons from now, right? Then he'll have to get his legs back under them, but we won't even know what the roster will look like, right? Because then they'll have to figure out what they're going to do with some of these guys contractually. Do they move some of them? What do you think happens with Mathurin, right? Because he's going into, year 4? So, he's kind of at a point now where, we're kind of waiting to see what happens with him, right? So because he's basically going to be a restricted free agent after this upcoming season.
Yeah, I mean, I would expect them to re-sign him at some point. Or extend him, whatever. But yeah, it is a interesting scenario because I feel like he's a little bit more he's one of the more forgotten players on that team, even though he has like a ton of potential, right? And I think we've seen the upside, but I think we've also seen the negatives of it, right? Like, a little bit of selfish play, in my opinion, that can only take you but so far in the league, but obviously very gifted, great at scoring, can use his athleticism for defense. So very well-rounded player. It's just that team is so deep, and sometimes there aren't really minutes for him. But I think if he was more consistent, he would probably get more minutes.
Right. Yeah. So, and again, it's funny because he showed at times in the postseason, right, some real chops, right, as a
Yeah.
playoff guy. But then, like you said, then there were other times where he wasn't really as much of a factor, right?
Hmm.
Just kind of up and down. But we'll see, because we'll talk about it in a little bit, right? But restricted free agency is getting kind of tough for some of these guys right now. Next offseason, it's supposed to be different. There's supposed to be more teams with cap space, so we'll see what happens. But yeah, I mean, obviously he's going to get more increased opportunities. So this will, I think, kind of be a make it or break it year for him. Obviously, there's not going to be Haliburton to balance it out, but I think he's got a real opportunity to show, what he can really do, in a different environment from what we've seen.
Yeah.
So now, we've gotten that out of the way again. So as we go through the offseason, we'll do this and, continue to talk about some of these teams and their off seasons and what we thought and where we think they're headed. But now we'll kind of get into a little bit of news and rumors. So we did get an update, I guess. Well, first off, I guess just for a quick thing, because it's been a little bit since the last time we talked, right? But Chris Paul did officially sign with the Clippers since the last time we recorded, right? 1 year deal, likely his last season in the league. We did, because there was so much reporting about it, we did talk about it before it happened, like assuming that it did happen. Of course, now that it did, right? I think we both kind of felt like, decent signing as a backup veteran point guard. It makes you older, right? You do kind of wonder defensively, what are they going to do? But they do have a ton of depth. And he is a guy that's been, an accomplished playoff guy. But at the same time, right, I'm not banking on it being the difference between them winning the title or not, because I just don't think that they're going to be able to win the championship and get through 4 rounds. But you can't deny that they have had a good offseason where they've signed a lot of, quality players, given what we kind of thought might happen in the offseason, because we weren't really sure what they were going to do. And I don't think we were really as confident that they were going to be able to really add much more talent than what they had, right? But they actually have been able to do that. Like, we didn't expect the Norman Powell trade at all. And that ended up happening, and they brought in John Collins and then replaced Powell with Beal. And now you're bringing in Chris Paul and you're bringing in Brook Lopez, to add as a backup big to go with, all that they put together so far. So, again, like, I'm sure he'll be fine. I'm sure they'll manage his minutes because, he's 40 years old now, right? So I don't expect him to have as big of a role as he did the last couple of seasons. Like, I mean, last season he was a starter. He's definitely not going to be a starter. And then in Golden State, he was a backup, and he'll probably play even probably less than he did that year, just because the age and the other depth that they have on the roster. So they have a lot of different types of lineups to make things work. Be curious to see Chris Paul teaming up with Harden again, because we know that didn't end well, but clearly it's okay enough for them to play again together. But what do you think now that it's official?
No,
Has your mind changed at all?
no, it's dope. I think it's pretty cool. Obviously,
Your opinion.
yeah, very cool farewell tour. I think that's probably one of the better ones that we've had, recently. So yeah, very cool. I don't really have too many, questions or concerns, in terms of fit. Right, he's going to be the backup. He's still clearly showed us, the past couple of years that he knows how to command an offense. So I'm not really worried about that. Obviously, the efficiency has dropped off a little bit, as his career has gone on longer. But, as long as he can just, run your offense off the bench and, be the solid point god that we know that he is, hey, no complaints from me, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, no real complaints. Just a matter of, again, you just kind of wonder how many, guys can they, work into this rotation, because, they have a lot of players and probably not all of them are going to play, but some of it could be matchup dependent and some of them could be moved on from at the deadline. Who knows? But they do have a good roster, right? I think this is definitely one of the better teams in the Western Conference, and if things go right, they could win multiple rounds, but I don't think that they're going to be able to hold up. And there's other guys I don't trust Harden at this point to be able to get you through a tough playoff series, right? Because I think we've seen a lot of that where it's probably not going to work out as well, but it's okay. We'll see what happens.
Yeah.
But moving on, then we had some news today from Shams Charania, right? A Kuminga update. And the update pretty much is that there really isn't much of an update. But I guess the main change here is that he believes that it could go on even longer, right? Because he's not because he believes that Kuminga isn't interested in really any of the Warriors' offers. So basically, he's kind of saying that it's a staring contest. He's in no rush to really do anything, and that it's possible that we don't even know what's going to happen. Now, there were a couple of other people, like I think Anthony Slater mentioned that Kuminga may be considering the qualifying offer, and then Jake Fisher also thinks that Kuminga will be back. But the problem is that as much as he may not want to come back, it doesn't really seem like there's any other great options. I mean, there have been teams that have been mentioned. The Suns and the Kings have been mentioned because they could offer him a starting role, but the Warriors aren't really interested in what those teams have to give up, right? Like I think it was Brett Siegel of Clutch Points who said that the Kings offered it was like Devin Carter, Dario Saric, and a protected first. Like if you're Golden State, you can't do that,
No.
right? Like that'd be insane. And then from the Suns, I think it was something along the lines of like Grayson Allen, right? I think is what we heard. Maybe something else. And that's the problem. Like it for both sides is that if you're Kuminga, yeah, it makes sense why you don't want to be here because you're probably going to come off the bench. You're going to be given a short leash. And, right now your goal is to try to play as much as you can and maximize your earnings, right? Like, I mean, technically he did win a title, even though he didn't really contribute a whole lot to it, but he's a young guy. So his goal is to try to get that next big deal. But, for Golden State, if they're going to move him, they don't want to move him for nothing, which makes a lot of sense. Like, I mean, if they moved Kuminga for Saric and Devin Carter, I mean, you might as well just say the season's DOA. I mean, obviously, Kuminga wasn't a huge part of their playoff run anyways. I know he played for them in the Minnesota series because Steph was hurt. But just as a whole, it's not really a situation that you really want to go into the season, right? It's not that I think that he's going to cause a stink and, just like pull a Jimmy Butler in Miami. But it's just you don't really want to be in a scenario like that. You want to go into the season with as much clarity as possible as to what your roster is. Because it's already been said that he's also holding up Golden State's offseason because they can't sign anybody while they're waiting for it, right? Supposedly they have these deals lined up for guys like supposedly Al Horford, maybe DeAnthony Melton, maybe even a Seth Curry, right? Those are guys that have been reported as guys that they're interested in, but they can't really do anything because the Kuminga deal, I think, kind of determines, right, how much they're going to be able to have to spend, right? Whether or not it's like just minimums or, the mini MLE or whatever it is. So we'll see what happens. I'm not predicting anything, but obviously it's pretty clear that this may not end anytime soon. And it's kind of a disappointment because, again, if you're Golden State, like, you're trying to hang on for dear life and try to, kind of maximize potentially what you could have Steph's and Draymond's last couple of seasons or however many seasons they have left. But you got to solve the Kuminga thing. But I also understand he's kind of at the level where he's like good enough where you don't want to necessarily lose him for nothing. But what's the likelihood that a team's going to give up a whole lot to get him? I don't see a team giving up a whole lot to get him. Maybe role players, and maybe that's the best that Golden State could deal with. But the worst case scenario kind of is the qualifying offer, almost in a way for both sides. Because for Kuminga, it's a gamble because if he doesn't play well and doesn't get the role, then he goes into unrestricted free agency potentially with not a lot of options. Maybe it doesn't matter anyways, but that's one side. And then from Golden State's perspective, well, Kuminga would have, I believe, a no trade clause. So if you tried to trade him, he basically can dictate like Bradley Beal wherever he goes, right? Like you can't just, be like, oh, we'll take back X, Y, and Z. Also, his contract won't be that big. So it's like, it'll be like $8 million or whatever. So you can't even really get a lot back anyways. What is an $8 million player really? I mean, not saying that that's nothing, but just as a whole,
in NBA value, it's very low.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of the issue there. And then obviously for Golden State, then if he doesn't get moved and he's entering unrestricted free agency, he's probably going to walk, right? And because he won't want to come back, and then you lose Kuminga for nothing anyway. So if it's the qualifying offer, that to me is the worst case scenario. But I also don't really know what's the deal. Like, what's the trade that makes sense? Because, if it's potentially those two teams, I mean, if you're Sacramento, I mean, yeah, like you want Kuminga, but I don't really feel like you're in a situation where like you have to get something done as soon as possible. But if you're Golden State, you definitely want to because you're trying to contend, and you can't really contend right now if you don't even know what your roster is going to be.
Yeah, I think the problem here is like there's no market. Like that's clear and very, very
Right.
evident, right? And like nobody really wants him. Nobody's in the market for a Kaminga. Like, look at
Yeah.
the teams, around the league.
Bad
Like
year for restricted free agents.
exactly. Like yeah, that goes for everybody. It goes for Giddy, it goes for Cam Thomas. These guys don't really have a market. Like all of the contending teams, like the legit contenders, like I'm talking
Right.
bona fide. They're
Yeah.
they're set. They were set years ago, right? So that's the problem here is like, it's a bad class, like you said, for restricted free agents. No market for any of these guys. And yeah, you might just have to settle. I don't know. This is I'm very curious what this is gonna turn out to be, but the fact that, this has become a holdout is kind of wild.
Yeah. So I think you were kind of on the side early, right, where you felt like he will not be a Warrior.
Hmm.
Do you still believe that that's going to be the case, that he ends up on another team, or do you
I
think he
don't
ends
know.
up coming back?
I mean, like, I understand
I don't know.
from his perspective, I wouldn't want to be there, right? I
Right.
don't think the Warriors want him. Like, if you want me to be honest, right?
Yeah, it's weird because it seems like there are like I think Lacob likes Kaminga, right? But it's kind of clear that like the coaching staff is not like a huge fan
Yeah.
of his, and I feel like some of the players are probably kind of frustrated by Kaminga
Oh
too.
yeah, for sure. Like, and he's a talented player, right? Like coming out of the NBA draft, like everybody knew his athleticism is great, but like outside of that, we haven't really seen a whole lot. And I don't think that's what the Warriors are really in the market for. Like they're trying to maximize, you know, the final good Steph years, right? And Jimmy years as well. And I don't think Kaminga really helps them do that. So I'm sure they'd love to find a deal, but nobody's biting because there's not a market.
Right. And it's wild because, I guess like from, the Kaminga perspective, it's just funny just because of like you said, the point of he's a great athlete, but it seems like some of the other connecting pieces, it hasn't really worked out.
Mhm.
Like say defensively, he's not a great defender. But it's tough because it feels like when you look at most of these championship teams, right? Like how many of these teams don't have some type of relatively young guy to be able to turn to? Like at worst case scenario, worst case scenario, it's a guy like we mentioned that's at an age like say an SGA
Mhm.
where it's a guy, that's like 26, 27, 28 or whatever. But then, their supporting cast is on the younger side. But when was the last time that we've had, a champion where it's mostly just kind of older talent and there's really not a lot of young talent, right? Like outside of I guess that Lakers team in the bubble, and then like the Golden State team that won the title. But even the Golden State team title, like you had Jordan Poole, right, who helped out, who was pretty, who was on the young side. He was one of the best players on the team, right? The Lakers had some young guys. I guess that was more of a veteran
Yeah.
heavy team. They
Yeah.
did have some young players that they were kind of looking for contributions from. I guess AD at that age, at that point, was like 27, so he'd be on the younger side. But just as a whole, they need some type of young talent that isn't just guys like Pajemski or Moody, where like they're good, but they're not, like they don't have as high of a ceiling as I think you'd
They
like
need a
to see
young
from.
third option.
Right, and like ideally it'd be a guy like Kaminga, but it hasn't worked. So if it's just gonna be trading him for guys that are better fits, okay, that's fine. I still probably wouldn't pick them to win the Western Conference. It's just a shame that it's not gonna work out because if it did, that would kind of be the best case scenario. But we've I think we've seen enough where it's just not gonna work. And I think I kind of my thought process, my early prediction, I think when this was first discussed, was I thought he may just come back on like a short term deal and maybe they work to trade him. Like, so I'm gonna, I guess, stick by that. But who knows, right? Who knows? Like you said, there's not really much of a market for a lot of these guys. So if there's no real market, unless something changes, I mean, we may be here a while. I mean, we may be like halfway through, the teams that we cover in the offseason. Who
Yeah.
knows? And it's holding up some of these other guys too, right? Because Jake Fisher and others have mentioned, hey, like Ben Simmons, right, is kind of looking for a place, and apparently that's holding up guys like Malcolm Brogdon and Russell Westbrook, right? Where I guess all these guys are kind of waiting on certain things to happen, but you need some of these other movements to occur before we get anything.
Yeah, exactly.
But I guess if you want to kind of touch on those guys, do you have an ideal spot for any of those players?
Not really. I'm gonna be honest. I mean, like I said, a lot of these contenders are really set, right? Um, yeah, I don't know where Russ would go. Um, like the Kings rumor was so weird when we first heard about that. So I kind of want to
What
just put,
happened?
I just want to throw that out of the window. I really don't want that to happen. Um, yeah, that's the problem. A lot of these teams really like did all their moves and they're kind of done, right? So I have no clue where those guys would go. What about
Yeah.
you?
I don't know. I mean, I
Yeah,
guess
exactly.
Brogdon, I think, would kind of be an interesting Knicks target.
That's what I was
Maybe just
thinking in my head. But they got
yeah, Simmons.
Clarkson. So I was like, whatever.
Yeah. Simmons, I don't know. I mean, I don't feel like he did like a ton for the Clippers. I mean, other than just kind of being like a big body. So maybe he goes to the Kings. I don't. Maybe the Kings sign him and Russ. Who knows? I have no idea what they're gonna do with that.
Backcourt
But
of doom.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, Westbrook still showcased that he's got some,
Oh,
that he's
it has
yeah,
nothing
that
to do with him. It's more so I don't want Russ on the Kings. Not because of Russ, but because it's the Kings.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So, but outside of that, I don't know. Like, I mean, again, these guys are still waiting because they're not high priority signings, right? But I think there are guys that could help and be like decent, like seventh, eighth guys on a roster, right? So that's kind of where we're at with those players. And I'm very curious to see where they go. Do we think anyone else potentially gets bought out?
Hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure. I feel like at this point we're probably at the limit with those. I really think the focus is going to be those restricted free agents, and whenever they sign.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll see what happens, but it feels like we're once we get the Kaminga thing, I think everything else will kind of work itself out. But I guess just to kind of wrap it up, and tie it into the Kaminga stuff. Say when they mention the Suns and the Kings, do you have a preference between the two?
For Kaminga,
Yeah, for Kaminga.
the Suns for sure. I think if he goes to the Kings, I mean they don't have a sense of direction, right? I mean, yeah, he could probably ball out, but I think if he was able to get to Phoenix somehow, that would be amazing, right? Like that's a bunch of young talent, alongside Devin Booker in terms of Jalen Green and Jonathan Kuminga, who I believe actually played in the Ignite together. So there's that. Um, and the plethora of guys that they brought in, via the draft and the, done as well. So I'm curious about that fit. I would like that more than Sacramento. Gosh.
Yeah, I'd say so too.
Yeah.
I'd say that like even if you don't feel like the Suns will be that good of a team, it at least feels like they have more of a sense of direction.
Exactly.
Right? It may not be like the direction that leads to a ton of wins, but it's more of a direction than the Kings where I can't really figure them out. Can't wait until we get to their offseason.
Oh boy, it's gonna be fun.
Yeah, so pretty much to close it out, now like we usually do, right? We'll kind of, look at, our that we normally put out on IG and we'll kind of just talk about the last results from that one. And what we put out was should Marcus Smart start for the Lakers? And this one was actually 50-50. We had 50-50 for yes and no. And again, I think you can make strong arguments for both because if you make the argument for Smart, I think you kind of were on board with the start Marcus Smart train,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I can't really disagree with you, right? Where you look at it and it's like, well, you can put him in the backcourt with Austin Reeves. Not quite as good defending point guards anymore, but better defensively and a little bit more switchable defensively in some areas than maybe like a Rui, where it's like he's probably better with like fours and maybe some threes, whereas Smart's probably better with like twos and threes. You don't really want him guarding as many quick point guards anymore, but he probably do a better job than Rui. But Rui's also the more talented player. So then how do you get into that realm where, are you going to convince him to come off the bench? Is there going to be maybe some crazy random trade that we don't expect? I don't know. But I think you can make cases for either one. I feel like ideally, like, especially if Smart could shoot better, right? And I know catch and shoot, he's okay. You probably would prefer him just because then you actually have a real guy in your starting five that you can turn to for defense,
Yeah.
right? Where if it's not that and it's, Rui, no offense to him, right? But you just don't have anybody in that starting five where you're like, all right, it's your job to go and guard the other team's guy. Or it's kind of forced into being Austin, who's not a horrible defender or anything, but you don't really want him being the primary defender in the backcourt. You'd like to have probably somebody else handle the tougher guard assignments, and then maybe he takes the other ones where he's like a chaser or something like that.
Listen, we've had a formula for winning titles, for the past few years, right? And there's always a defensive minded guy in the starting lineup, point blank, period. And the best teams have multiple. So I think the Lakers need to start Marcus Smart. There should be no ifs, ands, or buts.
Right. And that's kind of where that type of lineup makes a lot more sense, right? Just because you have more defense in there. And then, maybe you move Rui to the second unit and he cooks up, bench units and whatnot. He could still close, right? But just, ideally, like you said, when you look at most of the winning lineups and the traditional lineups, you got to have somebody in there, right, whose job it is, like I said, to defend. And if you put Smart in there, again, there are other guys that could be better options around the league, but on that team, you don't really have any better options, perimeter-wise, probably than him. Outside of maybe Vando, but Vando has the offensive limitations, right? That, again, Smart's not a great offensive player either, but he's got less offensive issues than Vando.
Exactly.
Even though, again, he's not an efficient offensive guy, not a great finisher, but he's got passing and playmaking chops. Again, if you want to hear more about our thoughts on that, you can check out our last episode, but I agree with the starting him, train.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, if you want to participate in our polls, you just go on at the OBT podcast on IG, right? We usually post it twice a week, and so you can check that out. Of course, continue to look at our other social pages, right? Also at the OBT podcast. Leave comments there. We'll try to read them if you leave one. Also leave comments on our shorts or on our regular videos. And of course, continue to like and subscribe to help the channel grow. Appreciate all the support. We'll see you next episode.